new installment in my series of videos where I investigate the narrative element in board games, talking mainly about older games. In this video I'm going to tell you about the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. First I'll tell you a bit about the game book, and then I'll talk about the board game that was inspired by that game book. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, the first game book published in 1982, written by Ian Livingstone and by UK Steve Jackson. And right here, I need to make a digression because I already noticed somebody right there, here in my previous sentence, is complaining, how is that the first game book? How about Tunnels and Trolls? Tunnels and Trolls is a role-playing game that was released in 1975 when Ken Santandroy was disappointed with the original D&D and created his own game that was simpler, more playable, and more based on narrative, on storytelling, rather than on wargaming and combat like the original D&D was. So the Tunnels and Trolls came out in 1975, and soon after, because it was hard at the time to find game masters, so the hobby was so small, the author came up with the idea of solitaire modules. So Buffalo Castle was created, and Buffalo Castle was the first role-playing game adventure playable without a game master, playable solo, and had the form that now we recognize as kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure paragraph-based type of story. If you want to go left, go to that paragraph. If you want to right, go to that other paragraph. And in the future, I'll make a video about Tunnels and Trolls solitaire adventures. Some qualified those adventures from the late 70s, and they continued creating them throughout the 80s too, as the earliest game books. I don't, because those really were expansions for a role-playing game created for a very small hobby at the time, for a very specialized niche of gamers, of players that kind of had to read if they wanted to play a role-playing adventure when a Dungeon Master was not available. It was very specialized, very unique, and really was part of a role-playing game. You needed to know Tunnels and Trolls already to play Buffalo Castle, to play the modules that were published in the late 70s and early 80s. Those were in game books that would be released in bookstores that people could get off the shelf. They could learn the rules and could play through the book and could read the story, enjoy the story, and play with a game system. There were interactive books based on the paragraph system, designed for larger readership, designed for bookstores, and those were the Choose Your Own Adventure books. Those started their publications in 1979, and probably because of the success of that, then later UK Jackson and Leon Livingstone decided to write a book that had that structure that allowed you to become the protagonist of an adventure, and you would move through a narrative tree making decisions, but they also incorporated game mechanics, and that was the new idea. That is the new idea that we have in the Warlock of Firetop Mountain 1982. A branching book where you make the decisions, where you had the adventures, that also incorporates game elements, but it is a self-contained book. You could pick up this book, learn the rules, and play and enjoy the adventure, even if I never heard of a role-playing game before, which actually, incidentally, is what I did. I started playing game books, branching texts with game mechanics, where you roll dice, you keep track of stats, etc., way before I knew what Dungeons & Dragons was, way before I knew what role-playing game was. I started reading these books when I was maybe 9 or 10 in Italy back then, in Italian translations, and I didn't discover D&D until I was, I believe, 15 or maybe even 16. I was maybe 14. But I know there were several years when I read these books, and that was it. That was, oh, there are stories that are also games. Later I discovered there were games that are also stories, and those were the RPGs. So to me, a game book is a different cultural thing. The psychology is different, the presentation is different, the workings are different. This is why I separate conceptually solitaire modules for role-playing games from game books. And so back to us, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain is the first game book. It was created by players of role-playing games. At the time, UK Jackson and Livingston were the UK distributors of Dungeons and Dragons, and they wanted to create a text that could give players a sense of how a role-playing game works. And initially, they wanted to create an adventure that would just be, again, an introduction to role-playing games. And at the end, they got so engrossed in the project, they enjoyed it so much that they wanted to bring it to a larger public, and they created a book that could stand on its own merits, that did not have to be seen as an introduction to role-playing games, but could be its own thing. And that actually was the genius idea. That really was the great idea that triggered the game book explosion of the 1980s. The Warlock was very successful, so they started writing more books with this idea. They recruited more authors. The fighting fantasy series was created, and that preceded other series that such as Way of the Tiger, Lone Wolf, etc., etc., etc. 1982, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, a visionary project, again, structurally, conceptually. When it comes to the book itself, to me, this is still one of the best game books that there have ever been. There's something pure about it. There is something archetypical about it. The idea was we're going to bring fantasy and gaming stories to people that do not know it yet. So what are we going to put in the story? They went as archetypical as one can be. Again, their knowledge was from role-playing games, and they knew what are the two things that people like to do the most: to find treasures and to defeat villains. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain is intensely about these two elements. You're a hero, you're going down a dungeon, trying to capture, to defeat Zagor, the evil wizard, and also to find the keys that will allow you to open the treasure chest and to take control of the treasure. So, the best of all fantasy worlds. This is what fantasy is about. Go back to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. It is about finding the treasures, and it's about defeating the bad guys. And Warlock of Firetop Mountain, again, does that in a very interesting way. It is a dungeon. As you enter the book, you enter the dungeon. There isn't much that happens before the entrance of the dungeon. Again, the authors, having played Dungeons and Dragons, knew that that was a fascinating element of the role-playing experience, really one of the defining elements. Many aspects of role-playing games that we found in D&D existed in wargaming before, but the idea of going down a maze, an underground maze of tunnels and rooms and facing strange encounters and monsters, that was the new thing. So they definitely decided to gamble all on that idea. The original book is all about the dungeon. And if you allow me some minor spoilers, it is one of the best dungeons to date still, because it is an uber dungeon, it is an hyper dungeon, it is a dungeon times dungeon equal, again, hyper mega dungeon. That is, it is almost like an anthology of different dungeons. The original dungeon that you are navigating in the Warlock of Firetop Mountain is divided in 3 sections that are pretty much representatives of the 3 main types of dungeons that you can have. Think of the dungeons that you navigated in your experience as a role-playing gamer, that you navigated in game books, in video games. Usually they fall within 1 or 3 categories. There is, let's call it, consistent, realistic dungeon. Say it's a dungeon of the Spider Queen. So things are spider themes. There are spider monsters. There are spiders. Things that are related to the community that lives around the Spider Queen. And in the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, the first part of the dungeon that you enter is of this kind, is consistent. You really had the sense that you're entering an area and you had to deal with the guards and where the guards live, and there are the areas where they sleep, the area where they eat, the area where they keep their prisoners, the area where they keep their weapons. Exploring this dungeon, you really get the sense of an almost realistic medieval environment. Yes, there are monsters, there are humanoids, but you had the sense that the idea of the designer was like, if there were people living here and having the job of guarding the dungeon, what kind of rooms would they need? How would they set up the area? In that sense, you have a consistent, realistic dungeon. as you travel through this, if you make it past that area, a portcullis falls behind you, sealing you from the previous area, and you start exploring the second area of the dungeon, which has a completely different flavor. It has the Zany dungeon. It is the Dungeons and Dragons dungeon. From the beginning, Dungeons and Dragons was about strange, unpredictable encounters. Here you start having those surreal rooms that do not make much sense with one another. It doesn't make sense that Monster A would be living next door with Monster B and next door with Monster C. And then there is a room with a deadly trap, and on the other side that the monsters are living. What do? Do they have to deal with the trap every time they go in and out? How do they go in and out? It doesn't look like they go in and out. You have the type of dungeon which is both the best and the worst. It's a bad dungeon in terms of narrative consistency. You don't have any sense of how the monsters that live there eat, how they feed, how they interact with one another, what they do where they're not reacting to heroes. You have the sense that each room exists as a micro universe, as a micro bubble, where the monsters are they're still waiting for the heroes to come, and then they get animated and they play a role. So it's narratively bad, but on the other hand, from the point of view of playing that adventure, that is one of the best type of dungeons that you have. It's probably my favorite dungeon, because each room, yes, is its own universe, but precisely because of this, you do not know what you're going to encounter next. If there is a statue, maybe like a normal statue, maybe a golem, maybe a magic statue, maybe a trap. In a consistent dungeon, what you saw in previous rooms informs you about what you're gonna find in the next ones. Here, a statue, a painting, a chest, any sort of item is almost like fluctuating in a bubble of mystery, because what happens around doesn't necessarily affect it. And so each room is its own adventure, each room is its own discovery. If I find a room where the pavement is divided in squares, where the floor is divided in squares, I'm immediately thinking trap. I'm immediately thinking what's going to happen here? What is the logic behind it? Whereas again, in a consistent dungeon, it may just be because the local leader really likes the kind of a floor in their castles or in their underground system or wherever it is. I like the kind of like zany, unpredictable, almost surreal combination of weird rooms with weird environments and weird monsters. And that is the central area of the dungeon. Then you go through the last area of the dungeon, which players that have played the game remember with mixed feelings. Nobody loves it, and yet people can be fond of it, because the last area is a very challenging maze. It's a tricky maze with secret passages, with teleporting passages, meaning your character may lose consciousness in one area, wake up, teleport in another area, and because of this, it's very hard to map, because you think it's a maze. Okay, the book is telling me go north, go right, go left. I'm gonna write down the possibilities, but then all of a sudden you find teleported to another area, and maybe you'll be mapping that for a while before you realize how and when the part of the map you're just drawing connects, overlaps with the previous one. Maybe you're going back as you thought you were discovering a new area. Also, the way the passages are interconnected in that section of the dungeon in the original book, there are one-way passages that do not always make sense textually, I should say contextually. If I have an intersection with four possible directions, the book is telling me I can go north or left or right, but not south. And I say, okay, I'll go north. Then I go north, and there's an intersection, and the book is not giving me the option of going back. So that's what I mean by one-way passages. Those are passages in the book. They're just tunnels, just hallways. You should be able to walk any way you want, any direction you want, but the book doesn't give you that option, which feels a little contrived and artificial, but works very well in creating the challenge of a maze that it's hard to navigate. Because it's easy to lose track of where you are. It's hard to retrace your steps. So there are all these sort of traps here. So if you put put together all the elements that I told you, really see how there are these three sections of the dungeon have different flavor, which is good because it gives you a sense of progression. It gives you a sense of really traveling deep into a subterranean world that has different areas and regions. At the same time, there is something for everybody. There is something for the simulationist. There is something for the dungeon explorers that simply want crazy, mysterious, surreal adventures, and something for the puzzle solver that likes to navigate crazy mazes. This is something that is typical, especially of digital interactive fiction. Players that play that type of fiction are familiar with the idea of the maze, and this also almost seems to reproduce the kind of thing. So different types of challenges with something for everybody. To me, in this sense, this is one of the best dungeons ever, just because it is almost a sum of all possible dungeons, or many possible styles of dungeon, which is remarkable when you think that this was the first game book. It may be the first game book, and maybe it seems so revolutionary because it was bringing the dungeon idea to people that are outside the role-playing gaming world, and so they were completely unaware of this. But it's a book that already looks erudite, it already has a tradition, it already has a history, it is already clearly benefiting from years and years of role-playing gaming culture that had developed in the previous years. It's the first book, but it's already, I wouldn't say old because there's a negative implication there. It's already mature in the sense that it already has a game and narrative vision behind that clearly benefited from the previous years in role-playing gaming industry. So of course, at the end you also have the final encounter with Zagor the Wizard. It's a fun encounter. Don't want to give any spoilers, but suffice to say, it's not just a matter of like, oh, it's a villain with the highest stats. It's an encounter where you do get to choose your tactics, what items you want to use, what approach you want to use. So it's more complex, but also more reward fights than the fights that you have against other monsters. And at the end, you also need to produce the correct keys to open the treasure chest. Maybe you defeated the villain, but let's face it, if you can grab the treasure, that is really a small victory, an unsatisfactory one. To really win against the book, you need to defeat the villain and find the right keys, open the chest and grab the treasure. And of course, the keys need to be collected throughout the dungeon. Overall, the book is very narrative. I mean, you do get the sense that you are explaining a story, but it also has a strong puzzle, almost riddle element. It is structured as a challenge. In that sense too, the book feels like a game book with a victory-losing condition, which you did not always have in Tunnels and Trolls adventures. In some of those solitaire modules, there wasn't a specific unique goal. You would just go down the dungeon, grab treasures, bring them out, and enjoy the aggrandizement of your character that resulted from the items that were collected and the experience points that were earned. Those modules were for characters that could originate outside of those modules and would continue living outside of those modules. In other solitaire adventures, you could bring them to sessions with other players. Those really were slices of a game world, and precisely because of this, they didn't need to have a clear origin, a clear inciting incident, and a clear ending. They could just be episodes, seen as episodes in a larger campaign. Game books such as Warlock of Firetop Mountain were stories, were individual stories, and yet again they seem to borrow elements from the gaming idea by presenting the player with a challenge, with a unique specific quest that needed to be accomplished, a unique specific set of objectives that needed to be achieved for you to get the sense that yes, you had triumphed against the game. So that also was interesting because it wasn't something that you had in previous branching fiction. For example, Choose Your Own Adventure books. You could have several endings in a book that were equally satisfactory. They were all equally good. You would decide when you wanted to stop reading, when you were satisfied, when you were happy with the ending or endings that you had reached. The same with Tunnels and Trolls modules, you decided when it was that you had grabbed enough treasure, collected enough points, and you left. Not so much with with the Warlock, because the book will let you know quite clearly that you have not reached the one ending, you have not found the one true way to victory. And precisely because there was only one way of achieving that victory, and that way is very well hidden in the book. It made the book particularly challenging, resulting, of course, in a higher degree of satisfaction for the players persistent or stubborn enough to stick with the book until they achieved victory. This is my mini review, not even that mini, of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, the book. If you haven't read it yet, look for a copy online. The book has been published many times in many editions. You can easily find affordable copies online. Definitely an experience still to this day. Is really stood the test of time well. It is still an incredibly enjoyable and rewarding game book. That for the book, I cannot recommend it highly enough. And since the book was so successful, a board game was also made out of that. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, designed by UK Steve Jackson only. As far as I can tell, Ian Livingstone was not part of the project. Well, let's take a look. I'll show you the map, I'll show you the components, I'll tell you how the game works, and then we'll see if it is a game that is as rewarding and engaging as the book was. This is the board of the game, and if you're familiar with the book, if you drew a map when you played the book, then you see that the board really is based on that map. It is reminiscent of the overall structure and design of the Dungeon of Zagor in Warlock of Firetop Mountain. It is a simplified version, but you can see that you have the river in the middle, you have the maze up there, and then here you have a system of hallways and rooms. In the book, the initial area and the central area are kind of like functionally different. They feel different, they are structured in different ways, they have a different theme. Here, they're kind of the same, so they're not as well differentiated. The maze is still different from the rest. You see the board is divided in, as we said, hallways and rooms. The hallways are divided in spaces. Each space takes a movement point to move through. And as for the rooms, most rooms have a random encounter and a random treasure placed on them. Some have fixed encounters, so there are tokens that you place there in all games. And so you know what to expect there, because they're simply game effects that are related to certain rooms or certain enemies that will always be the same. What the players are trying to do is to reach that area up there, the treasure chamber, and you need to get there, defeat the Warlock, and then you can get there. Now, as you can see, under that card, the treasure card, you place 3 key cards, random ones, face down. No one knows which cards go there, from a pool of several key cards that come with the game. So 3 are selected, well, are randomly drawn to be placed there at the beginning of the game. The other ones are distributed to the players, and also each player receives a blank key card. So suppose that maybe this will be my hand of key cards. Some will be numbered cards, and one of them will be the card that I showed you, the blank. Why this? Well, because there will be cases in the game where you will challenge the opponents, and so you will get a chance to look at least one of their cards. And looking at cards around the board, and also including knowing the numbers on the cards that you have, tells you which cards are not there. Because if I have card 9 and card 8, then I can exclude that key 9 and key 8 are in the chest. At Clue style, pretty much, you're excluding cards, you're excluding key cards until you find, you learn about the right combination of cards. Then you also need to find the keys, so you need to learn what those keys are, the correct keys, and find them. And keys can be found around the dungeon. The skeleton key, for example, can be used to replace or used as any one key. other keys, like this one, bunches of keys, then they have numbers. The winner of the game is the player that gets to the treasure chamber first with the right combination of keys. If you have combinations of keys that cover all possible combinations between number bunches of keys and skeleton keys, then you don't even need to know it. But there will be a point in which you may not have all the keys, but you realize that you have all that you need, then you start rushing in that direction. Each character has an adventure sheet used to keep track of the stats of the character. Players of fighting fantasy books will recognize this. This will look very familiar. This is what you have in those books. Well, here you have an area where you mark the keys that you have eliminated. And then here we have an area where you place your own keys. Here we have the stats, the same stats that we have in the books: skill, stamina, luck. What happens is that just like in the book, at the beginning of the game, you roll dice to determine your basic stats. And the random amount of points that you get in each stat is okay when you're playing the book, because it's you against the book. If I roll high, the book will be a little easier. If I roll low, it'll be a little harder, but I don't get a disadvantage against somebody else. Here, each player is drawing for their own stats. So actually, you may have somebody who rolls very good stats, very high, and another player that rolls very low, and then you have, well, a game that is completely unbalanced. Now, it's easy to fix, give every player the same amount of points, maybe to distribute or simply assign them the same stats, but when you read that in the rulebook, you already can get suspicious. You already wonder how much the designer really thought about making a game that was a game rather than simply translate the book into a board game version. And some of the things, of course, don't work quite the same. So, a problem that you can easily fix, but a problem that as soon as I read that in the rulebook made me very suspicious about the design. Equipment list. Here we will write the things that you will own. So you start with some items, some you may lose, some you may acquire. Actually, something else about the skills, about the things here. Something I should mention. Yes, there are ways of balancing things. So if you have a low skill, you get certain advantages. But if you have low stamina and low luck as opposed to other players, then there's nothing that can be done. Skill is used in combat. Stamina, when you go down to 0, your card is dead. Luck is used to take luck checks. Gold, if you have it, you can spend it for certain game effects. Provisions, when you eat them, they allow you to recover stamina. And treasure. You make notes of the treasures that are there. How does the game work? Well, super simple. You have a miniature representing your character on the board. You have the wizard, the warrior, several other miniatures, which are of course completely useless. You could replace them with plastic animals or wooden cubes, because the wizard and the warrior and the other characters, they all behave exactly the same. There's no functional difference. The only difference is based on the different stats and the equipment that they have. When it is your turn, you roll a die, and that indicates the number of movement points that you have. You move that number of spaces, not diagonally, only orthogonally. You're trying to reach chambers so that you can face encounters. And if you pass the encounter, some encounters will be special encounters. You will simply resolve the encounter as described in the text of the encounter. You have a player rate that tells you what the special encounters and special monsters do. So, for example, if you get a special encounter, you look at the symbol, you look at this player rate, and you resolve the effect of the special encounter. Many encounters are simply fights, and when you fight, the art is pretty neat. It has that slightly surreal, grotesque style of art that you have in so many illustrations of fighting fantasy books. So if you find a monster, you fight the monster. The monsters have skill and stamina. Combat is pretty simple and very similar, but not exactly the same as in the fighting fantasy books. Similar in that you roll 2 dice for yourself and you add your skill value, and that is your attack value for the present round. An opponent will play the role of the monster. We roll 2 dice, add the skill of the monster, and that is the attack value of the monster. If one side has a total attack which is higher than the opponent, that side hits and the opponent loses 2 stamina points. If it's a tie, nothing happens and you re-roll. This is exactly like you have in the book, but in the box. But in the box, also you have the option of spending luck points to deliver extra damage. And you do not have this here. There are ways that you can use luck to affect combat, and here you don't. So simply you keep rolling, rolling, rolling. Combat will take several rounds to resolve. And it's completely mechanical because there isn't a specific decision, and any decision you can make during combat to affect your chances of winning the fight. The only decision that you have would be to retreat in case things are going particularly bad. In most cases, you don't need to do that because the monsters are not all that tough, all that strong. Well, some are, like the vampire, but many of the monsters have fairly low skill, low stamina. The hero starts with an advantage, which is good because they need to face many monsters, as opposed to the monsters only need to face one hero before they die. So the hero should have some advantage. But on the other hand, many of the fights are not all that interesting. They just feel a little mechanical. I wish there had been a way of resolving combat in a single die roll rather than having to go several times. It slows down the game. It just feels, well, too much like in the book. Again, not everything that works in a game book works in a board game. In any case, if you complete the encounter because you defeat the monster or whatever are the requirements of a special encounter, then you reveal the treasure and you grab the treasures. We have keys, you have the weapons, magical items, money, etc., etc., etc. Different areas of the board will work in different ways. For example, to go across the river, there are several options here. You can pause the video and read the options on how to cross the video if you want. You keep going, 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 then you reach the area on the other side. The maze works a little differently because when you're adjacent to one of these tiles, you get to flip it and see if you can keep moving, and usually if you're lucky and you go through these tiles, you get an advantage. You move a little faster. These are pretty much shortcuts. If the situation is such that the placement of the tiles made all of these passable obstructed, it is still possible to go through the maze, which for people that have played the game is like the closest thing to blasphemy that this game has to offer. One of the most terrifyingly difficult elements of the book that people remember with pain and ache, but also satisfaction in a sense, is the maze. If you spent time navigating the maze in the original book, it was extremely hard to get out of that maze, but again, there was a huge amount of satisfaction that you could derive from that. Here, well, you don't have that element. Be the first player to get there, defeat the Warlock, get to the treasure chamber, and produce the right 3 keys. You are the winner of the game. The book may be one of the best game books of all times, and definitely one of my favorite ones. This board game is not one of my favorite board games of all times. Even if we narrow the categories, not one of my favorite fantasy, not one of my favorite dungeon crawlers, adventures. It's really not one of my favorite games in any category, because it feels very dated and mediocre. It feels like the transition from narrative, verbal based narrative of the game of the game book, the transition into a board game set, board game philosophy was not very smooth. It just feels like there were too many elements that were simply borrowed from the source and slapped onto the board game design without really thinking thoroughly about the effect that would bring on the overall experience. The game feels slow, uninteresting. The joy of discovery, of surprise that you have in the original dungeon, of course, is lost when you have a clear depiction of the map from the very beginning and you're there counting squares and trying to figure out what is the shortest way to get from A to B, rather than figure out what the heck am I, how the heck do I get out of this horrible passage. the simple fact that the maze is not maddeningly difficult already detracts from the fun when you compare to the kind of challenge that the maze presents. But as you can see, the problem is that some areas of the game feels too convoluted. Combat system really should have been simplified, should have been made shorter, because there aren't any decisions that you can make during combat. So the fact that you have to roll many times to determine the outcome of a fight seems unnecessary. So certain parts feel too convoluted, too many steps for what the machine or the design produces. And then you get to the part of the maze that, of course, you cannot really reproduce the riddleness, the cerebral puzzle nature of the original maze. And so what you have here is just a simple magnified Candyland, or magnified Chutes and Ladders with some possible branching tunnels, but it just feels like a roll and move game. And yes, I'm too old. I'm way too old to have to roll a die to determine if my character is gonna move by 1 square, 2 squares, or 6 squares. It makes no sense unless I'm playing Canada with my daughters, and my daughters are also like getting too old for that. It makes no sense that my barbarian this turn may feel very tired and just walk little baby steps, 1 square now, 1 square next turn, and all of a sudden rush through 6 squares only to slow down mysteriously again. Give me a movement allowance. This may be the word gamer speaking in me, the simulationist, the role-playing gamer. I can't stand characters that move at variable speed for no discernible reason. And so that's kind of the problem. It feels like a pretty much basic roll and move game with some really dated elements, with some elements that I found problematic in other dated games, such as the original Dungeon, the one with the exclamation mark at the end, the one that came out in the 1975, inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, I should say co-created together with Dungeons and Dragons. You may have it here. I'll be back. Here it is. This one. Well, this is one of the earliest editions of Dungeon, but as you can see, we are pretty much in the same realm, a system of caves and areas, and you will use cards to generate treasures and to generate encounters. Here you go. Prize cards and monster cards to generate encounters. The Warlock pretty much feels like an implementation of Dungeon, which was already a very mediocre game in itself back in the day. It was a roll and move with some fights in it, and with some problems such as, well, somebody goes before you and starts looting an area, you're lucky, then you're just lagging behind, desperately trying to reach for areas that haven't been looted yet. To be honest, the Warlock at least has a system of secret passages. From time to time you can teleport from an area to another, so you can kind of like go around that problem of the lucky person looted an area, and well, you should just go ahead of them. And there is some reason for interest there, but ultimately it still feels very slow and mechanical. At least there is still the problem that from time to time you'll be forced to use the secret passages because people have cleared the area that you were planning to explore. Maybe they found the right keys before you, and in this case you're really doomed. The reason you can find skeleton keys, but again, they're just so much luck based. There's so much luck involved in being the player that reaches the profitable areas before the players have looted the profitable stuff. There's a lot of luck involved in the fights, but especially in the movement, and also in finding the right keys. So in a certain sense, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain feels like the dated update of a dated game. What they did here, pretty much they remade Dungeon on a map that resembles that of the original game or the original book, and they added this clue mechanic of find the keys, check which keys are not, so you learn which ones are not the right keys, so you deduct what are the right keys. Not a big fan of Clue, not a big fan of Dungeon. Putting the two together in the Warlock to me didn't really get the job done, didn't do anything for me. So the Warlock of Firetop Mountain I found to be a bland, heavily luck-based game, which I think would not have had many reasons of interest for me, even if it wasn't based on one of my favorite game books. So yes, I may be biased in the fact that any comparison with a game book that is that awesome, it's somehow maybe unfair. Maybe I am being too critical of this game because I'm comparing it with such great game book. But my impression is that even if I had known nothing about the original book, this game simply would not be particularly interesting. And it's an old game. Should I be a little more respectful of our ancestors? Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, this is early period, early time of play of game designers trying to combine gaming and narratives. But frankly, this is from the 80s. There was already some wisdom there. There was a much more mature gaming philosophy behind the book than behind the game. And the game comes later, so it's really inexcusable. And frankly, I'd be more lenient against Dungeon, which is a fairly mediocre game, but I could see it as well a product of the early pioneeristic times where the hobby was in its infancy. We didn't know how to lead board gamers into dungeons. We didn't know how to do that effectively. And 1975, yes, I can see that. I still don't feel particularly like playing this game, but I can be understanding of why such a young hobby at the time could have generated a game that feels so bland. When we get some like 10 years later, things of course become more problematic. So even if I'm historically, this is a game that feels outdated and it feels like it did not bring enough innovation to early ideas of dungeon crawling in board games as it could have. So the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, pick up a copy of the book if you can find it. It's immensely enjoyable. It's still such a great book. As for the board game, just only if you really are a completist, if you really need to have one in your collection, like I do. So I'm gonna keep it just because of a piece of gaming history, even though not a piece that I think was particularly successful, no one that contributed much to the history of fantasy board gaming. It's interesting to me as a curiosity and as a big fan of the fighting fantasy series that was originated by the original Warlock book. It's interesting for me to have. Much more interesting to me to have than to play, really. I don't know that I'll play it again in the future. From time to time I'll look at it on the shelf, I made more or less a sound like this one, thinking about what a waste opportunity, how great it would be to have a board game that could capture the magnificence of playing the original game book. But as much as I would like to have a board game of that type, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain is not one. That's not the game that does it. That's not the game that replicates the joy of playing the original game book.